Good afternoon. We are here this afternoon to discuss the activities of NASA and of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, in regards to international cooperation, particularly in regards to cooperation with Communist China. When personnel from either of these organizations travel to the People's Republic of China, collaborate on projects, share data, or attend conferences, yes, there is ample reason for concern. The transfer of technology know-how is a serious national security problem. The Chinese Communist Party is aggressively using its military, economic, and political power to extend its influence and diminish ours. Its government is the world's single largest human rights abuser, and its assistance to other countries is well known, but the countries that it is assisting happen to be those countries which are run by governments who are oppressing their own people. The Chinese also facilitate the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to our enemies, even as they expand their own offensive capabilities. Our conversation here today must be viewed within that context, and any effort on our part to reach out to the Communist Chinese, to engage them on matters of technology, is, quite frankly, not just naive, but dangerous. Today's hearing was inspired by a legal opinion by the Government Accounting Office released last month, which states that despite clear legislative language, which passed both houses of Congress and that President Obama signed, that despite all of that, banning the OSTP and NASA from using appropriated funds for meetings with Chinese officials, the OSTP did so anyway. The GAO opinion states that by doing so, the OSTP violated the Anti-Deficiency Act and accordingly, quote, should report the violation as required to the GAO, which they have done so. The OSTP cites a Department of Justice legal opinion that Congress has no authority to limit the executive branch from pursuing, quote, diplomacy in any way as they see fit. They can do whatever they want in terms of diplomacy with whatever they see fit with whatever funds that they see fit. My colleagues and I will fight this overreach. And as we have in the past when we've seen such power grabs from whatever administration. And we believe in maintaining the constitutional division of power between the first and second branches of government and the limits of executive privilege. But that is not today's purpose. Today's purpose is to discuss the inherent dangers of transferring America's leading-edge science to China. China is an increasingly hostile and disruptive force in the world. The idea that we are cooperating with them in any capacity is alarming. China has aggressively sought our technologies through legal and illegal methods for decades. Anything that allows China any access to our technology or planning brings forth some major counterintelligence issues. Let me remind everyone about the Communist Chinese Party's 16-character policy, directing China to, quote, combine the civil with the military, end of quote. The Chinese government does not separate civilian and military programs. The People's Liberation Army runs the Chinese space program, and the People's Liberation Army is loyal to the Communist Party that runs the government of China. The Chinese National Space Administration is not like NASA, an independent civilian agency. Their space office is merely a public relations front under the command of the Commission of Science, Technology, and Industry for National Defense. Thus, China's space facilities are all manned and operated by the People's Liberation Army. I look forward to hearing from the OSTP exactly what was discussed at the meetings with Chinese officials and what was the purpose of those meetings. I understand that NASA Administrator Bolden, who we have as a witness today, also traveled to China and met with Chinese officials there, but this was prior to the law prohibiting that exchange. I would like to understand the reason for those trips and the meetings, and to find out why those risks that we have recognized in Congress are not recognized by the executive branch. If Administrator Bolden and Director Holdren if they believe in what the Communist Chinese are talking about in terms of space technology, if they believe that cooperating with these people, with the Communist Chinese counterparts, can be beneficial to the United States, I would like to know how we will then, if we are cooperating with the Chinese, avoid a repeat of what happened in the 1990s with Hughes and Laurel corporations, a scandal that advanced the Chinese missile program and put the entire world at risk. Now the states of technology transfer are even greater today than it was then, as China is now engaged in human spaceflight and intent on building a space station and a moon base in the coming years. 10 years ago, we thought we could manage the Chinese government and limit cooperation to only non-national defense areas. Well, we were wrong. What happened in the 1990s and the transfer of technology to the Chinese was a major disaster for the national security of our country. And the fact that the Chinese today are as far ahead in their space program as they are, this is a regime that's the world's worst human rights abuser. The fact that they are so far advanced in their missile and rocket technology can be traced right back to the transfer of technology in the 1990s from American corporations. They did not have to do the tens of billions of dollars of research and development necessary to have this kind of power in their hands. Why are we willing to give that to them? Why are we willing to take the chance that they will become more powerful based on our investment in technology? Well, we were wrong then, and the access we gave the Chinese military, not just their space program, but their military, was a huge leap forward, whereas they would say a great leap forward. And of course, excuse me, it saved them billions of dollars. So how can cooperating with China now, which is a vicious tyranny and a strategic rival, how can that be a smart policy when our experience tells us just the opposite? That's what this is about today. And Mr. Carnahan, a ranking member, if you have an opening statement, I'll get rid of this cough. Pardon me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today so we have an opportunity to review the issues that we expect to be raised. Respectfully, I have a different view on how we can positively engage with China and at the same time push aggressively for reforms. It's important that Congress exercise its oversight responsibilities seriously over expenditure of U.S. taxpayer dollars. We need to ensure that all appropriations are expended in accordance with U.S. law. Regardless of what the administration may think or what I may think of a certain provision, the administration should work with Congress to ensure that they are complying with all the requirements set forth in the appropriations bills passed by Congress. In addition to our oversight responsibilities, we should focus our time working on policies that grow and expand the U.S. economy. A strong engagement policy with China provides economic opportunities for both countries. It is clearly in our economic interest. Back home, the state of Missouri, where I come from, we have worked for several years to establish a Midwest China air freight hub in St. Louis as an example of the type of partnership that can exist between our two countries that is in both of our economic interest. As a result of working together, St. Louis is poised to become a major export hub for domestically manufactured products. As of 2010, China was the world's third largest buyer of Missouri products. With nearly $1 billion in sales last year alone, Missouri-made products exported to China are creating jobs here at home. With nearly 20% of the world's population, the Chinese market represents an opportunity for American businesses to create jobs here in the U.S. by making American products at home and exporting them to a ever-growing group of Chinese consumers. Strong relations and cooperation also create political space for progress in areas of disagreement, such as currency manipulation and intellectual property protection. Science and technology cooperation is an indispensable part of U.S. foreign policy and has been for decades. The growing belief that science diplomacy is a critical part of our tool case for advancing our diplomatic interest. Mr. Chairman, your former boss, President Reagan, was a great proponent of U.S.-China cooperation. In 1983, in his submission to Congress, he stated, quote, "It is in our fundamental interest to advance our relations with China. Science and technology are an essential part of that relationship," unquote. And on his trip to China in 1984, he stated that the U.S. and China needed to, quote, "expand our economic and scientific cooperation, strengthen the ties between our peoples, and take an important step toward peace and a better life," unquote. Science and technology cooperation is a bipartisan policy that has been effectively used by many different administrations. We absolutely need to advocate for policies that offer the strongest protection for U.S. businesses and the best economic opportunities for our citizens. But we absolutely need to continue science and tech cooperation between our two countries. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today as we address this important issue. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I think that demonstrates the respectful difference of opinion that people can have on these issues. I do want to know that you quoted me several times, whereas I was the one who worked with President Reagan on those very statements. What was left out was the little clauses that Ronald Reagan said, of course, that will all disappear if liberalization of China ceases to happen. Go back and read the speeches. And I know because I was assigned to work with President Reagan on those speeches. And it's very clear from what he said when he went there and before, that we should not be sending technology transfers. And all of these great things that we're doing with trade and investment should not happen unless China continues liberalizing, which it was at that time. When China murdered and slaughtered the democracy movement at Tiananmen Square, that ended those statements for Ronald Reagan. Reagan would never have gone along with that policy. Unfortunately, his vice president hadn't learned the lesson because President Herbert Walker Bush was president at the time and let the slaughter of Tiananmen Square go unanswered. We as Americans shouldn't have that type of value system. We have with us a champion of freedom, and Frank Wolf, who is a member of Congress from Virginia, chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science, and is the chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Congressman Wolf has been deeply involved in the issues and human rights issues and legislation, especially about the legislation that we are going to hear about today. He has admirably applied our shared desire for human rights to all areas of Congress's work. And he's a member who I deeply respect. And Frank, we appreciate you being with us here today. Could you shed some light on this particular part of the legislation, what it means, and whether you believe the intent of Congress has been violated?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for calling this hearing, and I think the American people would thank you also for calling this hearing. I've been very troubled by this administration's apparent eagerness to work with China on its space program and willingness to share other sensitive technologies. I want to be clear, the United States has no business cooperating with the People's Liberation Army to help develop its space program. We should also be wary of any agreements that involve the transfer of technology or sensitive information to Chinese institutions or companies, many of which are controlled by the government and the PLA. Space is the ultimate high ground that has provided the U.S. with countless security and economic advantages over the last 40 years. As a victor of the Cold War space race with the Soviet Union, the U.S. has held an enormous advantage in space technology, defense capabilities, and advanced sciences, generating entirely new sectors of our economy and creating thousands of private sector jobs. China has developed its own space program at a surprising pace, having gone from launching their first manned spacecraft to launching components for an advanced space station in just 10 years. But the Chinese space program is being led, as you said, Mr. Chairman, by the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. And to state the obvious, the PLA is not a friend, as evidenced by their recent military posture and aggressive espionage against U.S. agencies and firms, and actually against this Congress and against this committee. That is why I was troubled to learn from the press last fall about NASA Administrator Charlie Bolden's imminent departure for a week-long visit to China to discuss areas of cooperation between NASA and the PLA space program. I was more concerned to learn that Dr. John Holdren, head of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, had spent 21 days in China on 3 separate trips in 1 year. 3 weeks, 1 year, 1 China, 1 visit, 3 weeks, more than any other country. Very little information about these cooperative agreements with China were being provided to Congress and to the American people. So I included language in Section 1340 of the fiscal year 2011 continuing resolution preventing NASA and OSTP from using federal funds to develop, design, plan, promulgate, implement, or execute a bilateral policy, program, order, or contract of any kind to participate, collaborate, or coordinate bilaterally in any way with China or any Chinese-owned company. The provision in the Omnibus Appropriation Bill was agreed to by Republican and Democratic conferees. It passed both houses with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the President. The provision was clear, unambiguous, and non-controversial. However, less than 1 month after its enactment, I learned that Dr. Holden and OSTP had defied the provision. Even more troubling is that he withheld information about his intention to do so during an appearance before the House Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Subcommittee when we discussed, among other things, the implementation of Section 1340 and Dr. Holden's participation in the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue from May 2010. It's almost like not telling the truth by omission, because he never said anything there and then sent a letter up the next day after his hearing. This is why I asked the Government Accounting Office to investigate this violation and issue an opinion. I also asked GAO to determine whether the Office of Legal Counsel opinion provided by the Justice Department was legitimate. In October 11 opinion, GAO found, quote, the plain meaning of Section 1340 is clear. OSTP may not use its appropriations to participate, collaborate, or coordinate bilaterally in any way with China or any Chinese-owned company, end of quote. Further, GAO found that, quote, OSTP's participation in the Innovation Dialogue and S&ED contravened the appropriation restriction and added, quote, OSTP does not deny that it engaged in activities prohibited by Section 1340. The GAO finding also rebuts a September 11 memorandum prepared by the Justice Department, OLC, on the constitutionality of the provision. GAO stated, quote, "In our view, legislation that was passed by Congress, signed by the President, thereby satisfying the Constitution's bicameralism and presentment requirement is entitled to a heavy presumption in favor of constitutionality," end of quote. Finally, the GAO finding clearly notes, quote, "As a consequence of using its appropriation in violation of Section 1340, OSTP violated the Anti-Deficiency Act by using its fiscal year 2011 appropriation in a manner specifically prohibited. OSTP violated the Anti-Deficiency Act. Accordingly, they should report the violation as required by law." I also wrote Attorney General Eric Holder, asking him to hold Dr. Holdren to full account for his violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act by ensuring that it complies with all the reporting requirements and provisions of the law. I take the GAO findings very seriously. Following the law is not voluntary for the administration officials. That is why Dr. Holdren should commit today to full compliance with Section 1340 and publicly acknowledge his error in participating in the bilateral conference with the Chinese government. Now, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take a few minutes to put the administration's posture toward China in the broader context of the Chinese government. And I say government. The Chinese people are wonderful people. The Chinese people yearn for freedom. So when I say today, I'm talking about the Chinese government and their grave human rights abuses, espionage efforts, and detrimental economic policies. In June 1989, peaceful pro-democracy demonstrators gathered in Tiananmen Square. They were met with a brutal crackdown. As events unfolded, the world was captivated with the now famous image of the Tank Man, a lone, brave student protester who stood his grounds in face of the advancing Chinese tank, and to this day, his fate is unknown. During my first trip to China in 1991 with Congressman Chris Smith, we visited Beijing Prison No. 1, where authorities informed us, and we saw them, that approximately 30 Tiananmen Square demonstrators were behind bars. They were making these socks for export to the United States. They were making socks, Tiananmen Square demonstrators, and these socks were held up on the floor when we got back by Senator Moynihan at that time. We left with a pair, and there are the socks. Telling the image of the Tank Man, while famous around the globe, is virtually unknown within China thanks to the great firewall which censors so-called offensive speech. It is estimated that China employs 30,000 to 50,000 special internet police. Shockingly, the country has a thriving business of harvesting and selling for transplant kidneys, and we can furnish all the members of all the videos that cover this in detail, corneas and other human organs from executed prisoners. The image here, and I have the one picture of there, the image here shows the PLA, the same PLA that runs the space program. The PLA officers are preparing to execute prisoners. Later footage from the same story shows an unmarked van driving toward the prison to harvest the organs. When you watch the video, it will make you sick. Like many repressive regimes, the Chinese government maintains a brutal system of labor camps. The State Department's annual human rights report found, quote, forced labor remain a serious problem. Famed Chinese dissident Harry Wu spent nearly 20 years in a Chinese gulag. In congressional testimony earlier this year, he said, quote, when I finally came to the U.S. in 1985, although I was already 48 years old, that was the first time in my life I felt truly free, end of quote. He concluded by urging, quote, President Obama and the U.S. Congress to be bold and take a firm stand against China's human rights abuses, exactly the way that President Reagan did with regard to the Soviet Union. And he did it in a very appropriate way, and I know you were at his funeral. If you recall, he said, tear down the wall. He said, evil empire, and Gorbachev came to his funeral. But boldness is hardly the order of day when it comes to U.S. policy. That same could be said of some companies. Congressman Chris Smith and the late chairman of this committee, and Congressman Tom Lantos, himself a Holocaust survivor, convened a hearing in 2006 in which they publicly challenged Yahoo to look behind the bottom line and consider the moral implications of their complicity in imprisoning Chinese dissidents. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, and I appreciate he's been very good on these issues, authored a piece after the hearing, writing, quote, "Suppose that Anne Frank had maintained an email account while in hiding in 1944, and that the Nazis had asked Yahoo for cooperation in tracking her down. It seems," he said, "based on Yahoo's behavior in China, that it might have complied." Yahoo isn't the only U.S. company to come under fire for pursuing business interests at the expense of human rights. A May 22 New York Times article reported that Cisco customized, quote, "customized its technology to help China track down members of the Falun Gong spiritual movement," end of quote. There are multiple suits now against Cisco. These allegations reflect a worrying trend. American companies ought to represent American values. Instead, it seems that time and again, major U.S. corporations are embracing the Chinese government policies that are completely at odds with what America stands for. China, in turn, exports its repressive technology to like-minded governments. In October 27, the Wall Street Journal piece reported that the Chinese telecom giant Huawei, now operating in the United States, quote, now dominates Iran's government-controlled mobile phone industry. It plays a role in enabling Iran's state security network, the same people that killed all the people in Iran when we watched last year. It seems that not only is U.S. failing to change China, but rather China is changing us. Is it any surprise considering what China is spending on high-powered lobbying firms in this town? According to January 9 Washington Post story, in recent years, China has tripled the amount it spends on lobbying firms. But well-heeled lobbyists can't explain away China's abysmal human rights record. Thousands of political and religious prisoners languish in prison. According to the Cardinal Kung Foundation, Cardinal Kung was a Catholic cardinal. Currently, every one of approximately 25 underground bishops of the Catholic Church is either under house arrest, in jail, or under strict surveillance, or in hiding. Congressman Chris Smith took Holy Communion from Bishop Su. He's never been seen since. According to Bob Fu's China Aid in 2010, 336 Protestant house church leaders were arrested and persecuted. Since March 10 Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns have set themselves aflame. In desperation. I was in Tibet. That desperation. What drives 9 Buddhist monks and a Buddhist nun to set themselves aflame? Every monastery in Tibet has a public security police in the monastery. It would be like in your church or your synagogue, the FBI would be in there. What sets them aflame like that to drive them? And the Buddhist monks and nuns are very, very peaceful people. Chinese authorities continue to use Uyghur Muslim activist Reba Kadir, her children and grandchildren, as pawns to silence her. And her 2 sons are serving a length in prison. And the Chinese public security police sent people to Fairfax County to spy on her. Fairfax County. We have now seen that the Chinese government is unmoved and, in fact, emboldened in its ongoing repression, while at the same time experiencing explosive economic growth. We have seen our own short-sightedness in making the protection of basic liberties and the advancement rule of law secondary to unfettered market access and normal trade relations. These flawed policies, Mr. Chairman, have strengthened the oppressors. They have strengthened the oppressors and enabled China to advance economically at our expense. Every member here and every member in the Congress has constituents whose livelihood have been negatively impacted by China's blatant economic espionage, predatory and protectionist and illegal activities. Every single district. Meanwhile, U.S. companies are increasingly sending American jobs to China. General Electric's healthcare unit, their healthcare unit, you've seen their ads almost every Sunday on the Sunday news. Their healthcare unit recently announced it was moving its headquarters of a 115-year-old X-ray business to Beijing. Ironically, the head of President Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, GE Chairman Jeffrey Immelt, they're leaving the United States and they're creating jobs in China. According to a March 24 New York Times article, and we'll submit it for the record, GE paid zero taxes in the U.S. in 2010. Meanwhile, the Congressional Research Service found that the Chinese State Tax Administration and China Tax Magazine recently jointly released a number of lists of the top taxpayers in 2007, and GE featured prominently. The Beijing subsidiary of GE was number 32. GE pays taxes in China, does not pay tax in America. There's something wrong with that. It is noteworthy that GE, which pays no federal taxes in its home country, is honored for being a significant source of tax revenue in China. Our engagement with China has not only empowered the government, failed to change their political system, undermined their economic security, it has fueled China's military apparatus. Again, the president's job is at the center of these concerns. An October 28 Defense News piece reported that, quote, U.S. aerospace companies may unknowingly be helping China's military, end of quote. Specifically, the article pointed to, quote, last January's announcement by General Electric and the Aviation Industry Corporation of China, the government, that they would launch a joint venture for integrated avionics, end of quote, and cited the soon-to-be-released report of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which indicated, quote, that China has a robust, largely military space program, end of quote, with all but 13 of its roughly 70 satellites in orbit controlled by the military. And NASA wants to work with a PLA, killing people for the organs, spying against us, doing this, and a direct threat to the American military. In a May 17 article in Wired.com, it reported that Chinese troops have begun using a first-person shooter video game called, quote, Glorious Mission, backed by the PLA, which simulates basic training in which the enemy is apparently the U.S. military. On April 11, Aviation Week reported, quote, the PLA, the people who run this space program, has made great strides toward implementing a strategy to deter or defeat U.S. forces in the Western Pacific. The 2010 annual Pentagon report cited earlier found, quote, in the case of key national security technologies, controlled equipment, and other materials not readily obtainable through commercial means or academia, the PRC resorts to a more focused effort, including the use of its intelligence services and other than legal means in violation of U.S. laws and export controls, end of quote. Let's be perfectly clear about China, how it's advancing militarily. They're utilizing, quote, other than legal means. They're spying. They're stealing. The FBI has come before a committee approach. They got the most aggressive spying program of anybody in the history of this nation, much more aggressive than the KGB. The report also highlighted China's cyber espionage efforts. The U.S. intelligence community notes that China's attempt to penetrate U.S. agencies are the most aggressive of all foreign intelligence organizations. According to a 2008 FBI statement, Chinese intelligence services, quote, pose a significant threat both to the national security and to the compromise of U.S. critical national assets, i.e., you're losing jobs. You're losing jobs. 9% unemployment, and you're losing jobs. Their espionage isn't limited to government agencies. In an October 4 Washington Post article, Representative Mike Rogers, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, remarked, quote, when you talk to these companies behind closed doors, they describe attacks that originate in China and have a level of sophistication and are clearly supported by a level of resources that can only be a nation-state entity, end of quote. These breaches in our national security infrastructure are rampant and pose a very real threat. A May 14 Reuters story indicated, quote, North Korea and Iran appear to have been regularly exchanging ballistic missile technology in violation of UN sanctions, according to a confidential UN report. The report said the illicit technology transfer had transferred shipment through a neighboring third country, China. China is also a major arms supplier and source of economic strength to the regime in Sudan, in Khartoum, Sudan. According to Human Rights Watch First, during the years of the worst violence in Darfur, China sold $55 million worth of small arms to Khartoum. I was the first member of the House to go to Darfur. Sam Brownback was with me. We heard the stories of rape and killing and displacement. And America gave guns to them. America's giving food, the Chinese the weapons. The Janjaweeds circulate around the camps, and when the women go out in the morning to collect wood, and China's the #1 supporter. The largest embassy in Khartoum is the Chinese embassy, and they're aiding them. And meanwhile, Beijing, right there, that picture of Beijing rolled out the red carpet this year for Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, an internationally indicted war criminal. Bashir's crimes are not just things of the past. Bashir's crimes are going on today. In the Nuba Mountains, we have reports they're going door to door, pulling black people out and killing them. We had a hearing before the Tom Lantos Committee. The #1 supporter is China. They're blocking the UN missions to go there. I mean, they have been, and Bashir is indicted by the International Criminal Court. Why did we go after and help get Milosevic, which we should have, and get Radic, which we should have, and get Karadzic, which we should have, and yet we close our eyes and do nothing with regard to Bashir, who goes to China? They had an obligation, if they wanted to be part of the world nation, to arrest Bashir when he landed, and to keep in mind, he's an indicted war criminal. Speaking of the red carpet, President Obama, the 2009 Nobel Prize winner, welcomed Chinese President Hu Jintao, who was the author of the crackdown in Tibet, and is pushing what is taking place, to a dinner in the White House when the 2010 Nobel Prize winner, Xiaobo, was in jail. His wife was under house arrest, and nobody could even go to Oslo to pick up the prize. In closing, and I am closing, there will come a day, I think the Chinese government's got to hear that. There will come a day when the Chinese government will fall. Repressive, totalitarian regimes always do, because the good effort of President Reagan, God bless him, and Pope John Paul and Margaret Thatcher, the Soviet Union collapsed. Many people in 1986 never thought it would collapse. This Chinese government, they have taken Ceausescu's playbook, and where it led Ceausescu, it will lead this government. They will fall, and books will be written about who helped sustain this government in their final days. Will U.S. companies feature in that narrative? Will U.S. government officials feature in that narrative? In 2001, a book was published, every member ought to read it, entitled IBM and the Holocaust. A New York Times book review describes how IBM had, quote, global control of a technology that was enormously helpful, indeed indispensable to the Nazi machinery of war and annihilation, end of quote. The Times review quotes the author of the book as saying that many companies did what IBM did. He then said they, quote, refused to walk away from an extraordinary profits obtainable from trading with a pariah state. Arguably, that assessment rings today. Only the pariah has changed. Those in position of leadership, be they in the private sector or in government, do our country a disservice when they gloss over or ignore the actions of the Chinese government. They put us, quite frankly, squarely on the wrong side of history. The Chinese government brutally represses its own people. It persecutes people of faith, Catholic bishops, Protestant pastors, Buddhist monks and Buddhist nuns, Muslims. It censors the internet. It maintains labor camps. The Chinese government is actively engaged in cyber espionage. It steals state secrets. It aligns itself with the countries directly at odds with U.S. interests. It supports genocidal governments and buttresses regimes that should not be in power. There is a legal term for this. It's called willful blindness that aptly describes the dealings to date with China. Faced with these painful truths, blindness is no longer an option. In the words of British abolitionist William Wilberforce, he said, quote, having heard all of this, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf, and obviously the chair agrees with everything that you just said. So I would leave it to my ranking member if you have some questions for Mr. Wolf.
No, just again, I want to, you raise a number of serious questions. I think that we need to be contemplating. I appreciate your work on the Human Rights Commission. And I do believe we need to, personally, I believe our approach should be one of engagement, but also pushing for reforms in many of these areas that you've brought forth here today. So, but I think this is a very important conversation that we're having here today, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Mr. Wolf, let me just note for the record that while what brought about the change in the world when the Soviet Union collapsed and democratic Russia was born, and it's not quite totally matured yet, and it's still struggling to be a free country, but they've made great strides since the 1980s. But what brought the Communist Party to the point where it collapsed and spared the world an incredible Holocaust where a military exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States would have cost millions of lives. It would have been horrible. What saved us from that was a lack of engagement. The fact is that we did not give the Soviet Union any of the economic rights that you have just outlined that we have given China. We have permitted China basically a one-way free trade policy. We've turned our backs when they manipulate the currency. We've turned our backs when they steal technology. We actually have invested huge amounts of our technology and our capital in building up their economy. We didn't do any of that with the Soviet Union. People would have been laughed at if they would have said, well, why don't we turn GE loose in Russia when Russia was controlled by the Communist Party to work out a good relationship with their industry that produces jet aircraft. I don't believe that by this current strategy that we have permitted our country to move forward with China despite these atrocities that you've outlined, I don't believe that's going to lead to a free China. And I would hope that we, in our lifetime, can see the Chinese people break their chains, and we can be proud that we helped and sided with the Chinese people rather than the dictatorship. So thank you. One last question before you go. You are then convinced that the law as written, as you actually helped put it into the law, was violated by these exchanges with OSTP?
I do believe, and we are going to continue this issue and stay with it until the very, very end. But I do believe, and also the GAO also believes. And the comment is, I think you're exactly right. No company or law firm would have ever represented the Soviet Union during the days of President Reagan. I remember there was somebody talking about doing something for a bus company, and Reagan spoke out. President Reagan said the words in the Constitution were a covenant with the rest of the world. The students in Tiananmen knew those words, and Reagan, one party called him in '83, said tear down that wall, and yet he did it in the appropriate way. But our government, when they would go to Moscow, as you know, George Shultz would open, the embassy was an island of freedom, and they would meet with the dissidents and everything else. We're not seeing that today.
Now,
You're exactly right.
And an amendment to this question, the last question is, if this is a violation of law or not, do you believe that the executive branch is immune from these type of restrictions that you helped place in the law, and that we all placed in the law when we voted on that piece of legislation? Does the legislative branch have a right to limit what the executive branch does in foreign policy?
Under the Constitution, it does. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you for your testimony. On panel number 2, we have Thomas Armstrong, who is the Managing Associate General Counsel at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, he's one of the leading attorneys working on the Budget and Appropriations Group. He is responsible for the Comptroller General's appropriations, law opinions, that the GAO issued to Congress. Mr. Armstrong joined the GAO Office of General Counsel in 1978 and is a member of the bar in Virginia. Mr. Thomas, you just heard a long bit of testimony, but we will get now to some of the specifics. I think it is important for us to realize that we aren't talking about some esoteric situation where people's lives are not at stake, that there's just a difference in trade policy or something. No, we're talking about a fundamental historic perception and the laws that go with those perceptions in terms of an adversary for the United States or someone who could be a friend of the United States. You may proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate this opportunity. I am here to talk about the law. I am here to talk about the prohibition that was enacted to serve Congress's constitutional power of the purse. I have a short written statement to submit for the record, if I may. A copy of
So ordered.
Thank you. A copy of our October 11th legal opinion that Mr. Wolf mentioned and that you mentioned in your opening statement is included as an appendix to that written statement. In the opinion, we determined that OSTP violated a statutory provision prohibiting the agency from using its appropriations for bilateral engagements with China. That provision, enacted on April 15, 2011, in the Full-Year Continuing Appropriations Act for fiscal year 2011, prohibited OSTP, as well as NASA, from using appropriations to, quote, develop, design, plan, promulgate, implement, or execute a bilateral policy, program, order, or contract of any kind, to participate, collaborate, or coordinate bilaterally in any way with China or any Chinese-owned company. Because OSTP had no funds available for that purpose, OSTP's actions also violated the Anti-Deficiency Act. The Anti-Deficiency Act is a fiscal statute that is central to Congress's constitutional power of the purse. Between May 6 and May 10, 2011, OSTP, as they told us, participated in a series of meetings with Chinese officials as part of two events here in Washington, D.C., the U.S.-China Dialogue on Innovation Policy and the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. OSTP also hosted a dinner for Chinese dignitaries. OSTP did not deny that it engaged in these prohibited activities. Rather, OSTP asserted that the prohibition, as applied to these activities, is an unconstitutional infringement on the executive's conduct of foreign affairs. As we stated in our opinion, it's not GAO's role to adjudicate the constitutionality of legislation that's been enacted into law. That role is properly reserved for the judiciary, not an agency like GAO that's part of the legislative branch. Legislation like this, which was passed by both chambers of Congress and signed into law by the President, thereby satisfying the Constitution's requirements of bicameralism and presentment, is entitled, in our view, to a heavy presumption of constitutionality until a court indicates otherwise, or until Congress changes that law. In other words, in our opinion, and in opinions like this, we at GAO apply the law as written to the facts before us. By using its appropriations in violation of that prohibition, OSTP also violated that Anti-Deficiency Act. In addition to audits and investigations, GAO serves an important function by providing legal opinions to members of Congress and federal agencies on matters of appropriations law. That is to say, those laws, including the Anti-Deficiency Act, that govern the proper use of federal funds and that help protect Congress's constitutional power of the purse. The Anti-Deficiency Act is a funds control statute designed to impose fiscal discipline on federal agencies. Under the Act, an officer or an employee of the United States government may not make or authorize an obligation or an expenditure exceeding the amount of an available appropriation. Simply put, agencies may not spend more than Congress gives them. When OSTP used federal funds to engage in the innovation dialogue, the strategic and economic dialogue, and the dinner to host Chinese dignitaries, OSTP spent funds in excess of the amounts available, in excess of the amounts Congress gave them for this purpose. Congress, with the prohibition, had made clear that OSTP had no funds available for this purpose. OSTP therefore violated the Anti-Deficiency Act. In order to emphasize sound funds control and to advance oversight of agencies' fiscal activity, the Anti-Deficiency Act requires that executive agencies report violations to the President and Congress and transmit copies of their reports to GAO. In the opinion, we advised OSTP to report its violation as required by law. Late Monday afternoon, OSTP provided us with its Anti-Deficiency Act report. In the report, OSTP disagreed with GAO's conclusion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Carnahan. I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for that succinct testimony. And you have stated then that there is, when something is put, wording is put into legislation, that's very clear, specific wording, that you have a heavy presumption of constitutionality. Maybe you could tell me, is there a difference between what is legal and what is constitutional?
No, not really, because all of our laws are derived from the Constitution. We have a long history at GAO in serving Congress's constitutional power of the purse to presume, accept the constitutionality of any law that is enacted via the constitutional legislative process. Any law that's passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the President, which is what happened in this case.
Okay, is there a constitutional restriction on the legislative branch from putting limits to which money can be spent concerning American foreign policy?
The Supreme Court and other federal courts, lower federal courts, have long recognized that Congress does have the right to impose restrictions on the executive's use of public funds. It all relates to Congress's constitutional prerogatives of the purse.
So this is the power of the purse is a supreme constitutional prerogative of the legislative branch, and that if the restrictions that we put on the power of the purse affects foreign policy, that is within the jurisdiction of the legislative branch.
We didn't look specifically at OLC's Office of Legal Counsel over at the Department of Justice at the arguments that they presented to OSTP. We felt we didn't need to go beyond the fact that this law was enacted via the constitutional legislative process.
Okay, so it was a constitutional legislative process, but they were actually asking about the constitutionality of the outcome of the process and not necessarily the process itself, which is interesting. You have stated very clearly that the OSTP spent funds in access to what the government, meaning what the legislative branch, had declared was legal for them to spend. Thus, it was in violation of that particular law. And again, I guess I'm looking for, and we'll discuss with the administration later on, this theory that they can do whatever they damn well want to do if it has to do with foreign policy. And dealing with China has some, is by its nature dealing with foreign policy. All right, you have given us some insights. Mr. Carnahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you.
I want to jump right into this question that you have raised. And while I understand your earlier testimony and that GAO did not make an assessment of constitutional claims put forth by the Justice Department, has GAO made determinations in other instances where an administration has made constitutional claims? And if so, how did GAO handle that?
We have we do steer clear of addressing constitutional issues. We do have a long history, since our role here in the appropriations law decision-writing function is to serve Congress and Congress's oversight of the executive's use of public money.
So just to be clear, steer clear, you mean they never have addressed any constitutional issues? Or they generally don't? I mean, that's what I'm trying to get down to.
You know, sir, I've been at GAO for 33 years now, and I've been involved in the appropriations law function for about 21 of those years, and I've never been involved in addressing a constitutional issue in the context of Congress's power of the purse.
And again, just to be specific, you have never been involved with that. Has GAO ever been involved in addressing a constitutional issue, to your knowledge?
I'm not aware of it, no.
So,
In the context of appropriations law.
so in other contexts, you are aware, but not with regard to appropriations?
I can tell you that I'm not aware of it, but I'm not necessarily in a position to have been aware of it because of my focus on appropriations law and my responsibility with regard to the appropriations law decision-writing function.
I think I understand that, Mr. Armstrong. Let me move on. Since the administration submitted its report to GAO, has it fully complied with the requirements pursuant to the Anti-Deficiency Act?
We do consider that report to be satisfying the reporting requirement of the Anti-Deficiency Act.
And describe that for the committee, please.
When an agency violates the Anti-Deficiency Act, as it did here, the Act requires that the agency report it to Congress, the President, and to GAO.
And that was done?
And that was done, yes.
Okay. And can you describe that report just in brief?
Yes, I can. They did acknowledge GAO's conclusion. OSTP reported its disagreement with GAO's conclusion. OSTP summarized Justice Department's advice to OSTP. The report, fairly short, about 4 or 5 pages, didn't go further than that. But it did serve to put the matter before the Congress in Congress's oversight capacity, which is the point of the Act.
In bottom line dollars, how much money are we talking about?
OSTP told us that they spent about $3,500.
Okay, well, with regard to an Anti-Deficiency Act issue such as this, what is the enforcement mechanism once the reporting requirements are met, and what is the typical resolution in a case like this?
Sure. The enforcement mechanism is really Congress's enforcement and how Congress wants to react to the Anti-Deficiency Act report. The Act is there to serve Congress and Congress's oversight of agency activities. So it really is up to the discretion of this committee, of the appropriations committees of the Congress.
Very good. Thank you.
And when did the OSTP actually provide you report this violation?
It was late Monday afternoon this week.
You're talking about this Monday?
Yeah, today's Wednesday, day before yesterday, yes.
Mm-hmm. So this Monday, after this hearing had already been scheduled, was when they saw fit to comply with this request. I think that has to be taken into consideration, and the ranking member just asked several questions I thought were important, and you suggest that if there are any penalties, Congress must be the one to provide some reaction to this violation. But you're suggesting that the money was spent that was illegally spent, and now it's up to Congress to act? Is that it?
Yes, that's the way the mechanism is designed under the Anti-Deficiency Act.
Okay, and there's no criminal penalty to this?
Well, the act does include criminal penalties for knowing and willful violation of the act. That is in the Justice Department's discretion. My understanding is that the Justice Department has never prosecuted anyone for a knowing and willful violation, so we don't have any clue from their case law and their activity what justice would consider to be a knowing and willful violation.
Okay, and one last question about if a piece of legislation like this is signed into law, which it was by the President of the United States, President Obama signed the bill, do we then presume that President Obama agrees with the constitutionality of the restriction that's been placed upon him by the bill?
I am really reluctant to make a presumption about what the president might think.
Well, it's not, are we presuming if a president signs a bill into law and there is a restriction in that law of the executive branch, that the president is signing that bill into law, and thus any president that does that is reaffirming a constitutional acceptance of the law?
There are occasions when a president, in signing a bill into law, might question the constitutionality of provisions, and in the president's signing statement, the president may make a point about his concerns about the constitutionality of a provision. We did look at the signing statement for this law, and there was nothing in this signing statement that raised any concerns about this provision.
Okay, so in the past, if the president did have a concern about constitutionality of any restriction in the law, and he wanted to sign it anyway because of other provisions, that would be in his statement upon signing the bill.
There is a tradition there. That doesn't mean that we can presume, I think, that because the president did not make a point in his signing statement that he accepts the constitutionality of it. But I can tell you that there was no point made in the signing statement for this law about this provision.
Mr. Carnahan? Sure.
Just one more question. I'm going to put this in context. Has, in your experience, and you've been doing this for a number of years, over a number of administrations, has this issue come up in with prior administrations?
Not with GAO, but I can tell you, although I'm not a constitutional law scholar, as a lawyer, I am well aware that there has been tension over the years between presidents and Congress over the conduct of foreign affairs. But that's not something that we've looked at. It's not really in GAO's purview.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, and our third panel will be Charles Bolden, Administrator of NASA.
Thanks very much.
We have our next panel seated, and I guess we're going to have Holdren and Bolden together, I was noticing that their names, there's a similarity there between the names of all the witnesses today. That is interesting. So we have first witness will be Charles Bolden, who is currently administrator of NASA and has served that post since 2009. We could say the Honorable Charles Bolden, but I would prefer calling him General Bolden. My father was a pilot in the U.S. Marine Corps, and as I've said many times, would be very proud to know that we have a Marine pilot now heading up NASA, and I think he's done a great job since he's been there under very, very strenuous circumstances. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and went on to fly over 100 combat missions in Vietnam. Afterwards, he joined NASA and flew 4 space shuttle missions, 2 of which he commanded. And we also have with us Dr. John Holdren, who is Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and co-chairman of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Dr. Holdren went to the White House from his post at Harvard University, where he was a professor, and he holds a degree from MIT and Stanford, and has a long and distinguished record of service in scientific bodies, and is one of the more respected scientists in the United States of America. And we appreciate the service that both of you are providing to our country. And doesn't mean we don't have our disagreements, which is what this is all about today, but that does not diminish the gratitude that we should have towards people like yourselves who are willing to take on these kind of responsibilities. You both may proceed with your opening statements, and then we'll go into questions and answers.
Mr. Chairman, do you have a preferred order for those statements?
Yes, I can see that the general is giving us a direction over there.
All right.
You'd go first.
I will proceed. Thank you very much. Chairman Rohrabacher and Ranking Member Carnahan, I do appreciate the opportunity to testify today on U.S.-China cooperation in science and technology.
Put the microphone a little closer. There you go.
In general, the United States benefits from science and technology cooperation with other countries when the sharing of facilities or expertise and costs speeds up discoveries that can be applied in this country to address economic and other challenges that we face. We also benefit from such cooperation when it enhances the understanding of and access to foreign markets by U.S. firms, enabling them to sell more abroad. We benefit as well when such cooperation accelerates innovation in other countries in ways helpful to U.S. interests, such as by reducing their pressure on world oil supplies and their emissions of greenhouse gases. And we benefit when science and technology cooperation provides a set of positive interactions and incentives with countries with which we have difficult relations. Those general benefits of cooperating with other countries in science and technology all apply with particular force to the case of China, as my written statement explains. Of course, the benefits of cooperating with other countries in science and technology have to be weighed against the costs and the risks. Those risks include theft of intellectual property and classified information, and loss of economic or military advantage. And just as the benefits of science and technology cooperation apply with particular force in the case of cooperation with China, so do the risks. The relations of the United States with China are complex overall. The two countries behave as partners in some arenas, as competitors in some, and as potential adversaries in some. This administration strongly objects to China's human rights abuses, its theft of intellectual property, and much else that goes on there. But we in this administration do not believe that the solution to these challenges is to cut off our science and technology cooperation with China. On the contrary, we believe that U.S.-China science and technology cooperation in forms that benefit both countries strengthens our hand in the effort to get China to change the aspects of its conduct that we oppose. And we believe that the overall benefits to our country of properly focused and managed science and technology cooperation with China outweigh the costs and risks. That proposition was the reason that the Carter administration concluded the U.S.-China Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement within weeks of the normalization of relations with China in January 1979. and it's the reason that that agreement has been renewed by every administration since, Republican and Democratic alike. My written statement describes some of the ways that U.S.-China science and technology cooperation under this framework has benefited United States interests. The only one I'll mention here is how the ongoing U.S.-China dialogue on innovation policy, which I co-chair on the U.S. side, has led to the Chinese government's rolling back aspects of Chinese innovation policy that discriminate against U.S. businesses active in Chinese markets. As has already been pointed out by earlier witnesses, Section 1340A of the Continuing Appropriations Act of 2011 contains language intended to bar OSTP from continuing to engage in bilateral interactions with China. I'm a scientist and not a lawyer, so I'm only going to state here very briefly why OSTP has not complied with that prohibition. For the details, I refer you to the formal opinion issued on September 19th of 2011 by the Office of the Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, and I ask that that be added to the hearing record as an addendum to my testimony.
Without objection.
OSTP sought the Department of Justice's guidance on Section 1314A's legal effect because of the extent and the importance of OSTP's role in bilateral diplomacy with China on science and technology issues. The Department of Justice advised us that the activities that OSTP has been carrying out in connection with that role fall under the President's exclusive constitutional authority to conduct foreign diplomacy and thus are not precluded by the statute. Let me conclude by referring once more to President Reagan. As Congressman Wolf pointed out, President Reagan did call the Soviet Union an evil empire. He also continued throughout his 2 terms the extensive U.S. cooperation on science and technology with the Soviet Union that had begun in 1958 under President Eisenhower and that continued until the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. I very much hope that the value to this country, on balance, of appropriately focused and managed cooperation with China on science and technology is something about which this administration and this Congress can also come to agree. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holdren and General Bolden.
Chairman Rohrabacher and Ranking Member Carnahan, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear here today. This is a critical time for our nation's space exploration program. We've embarked upon an ambitious plan agreed to by President Obama and the bipartisan majority in Congress to maintain U.S. leadership in space for many years to come. Private U.S. companies will soon be taking over transportation of cargo and crew to the International Space Station. A deep space exploration vehicle and crew capsule to take humans farther into the solar system than we've ever gone before is in development. Science missions to Jupiter, an asteroid, the Moon, and Mars are getting underway. Our technology development efforts are getting closer to demonstration, and our aeronautics research is helping to advance cleaner and safer air travel. For 50 years now, America has led the world in space exploration. Under the plan we have committed to as a nation, we will continue to do so for the next 50 years. It's important to note that our national success has been achieved in part thanks to international cooperation. Strategically, we've entered into agreements that advance our national objectives and further the causes of science, space exploration, and discovery. Currently, we have over 500 active agreements in place with 120 nations, excluding China. The United States has always led, but we also work with other countries when it serves our national interests. Having the flexibility to enter into these partnerships has been an important part of America's success in space exploration. Over the last decade, NASA has had a very limited bilateral cooperation with China entities due to U.S. law and policy. In fact, NASA has only signed one agreement with the Chinese Academy of Sciences for the exchange of data for geodynamics research related to the prediction, monitoring of, and response to natural disasters. Additionally, joint working groups on Earth and space science were established in 2007 under the Bush administration, and there have been reciprocal visits of NASA and People's Republic of China officials to facilities in each nation. I would like to emphasize that support for cooperation with China has spanned multiple administrations. NASA's bilateral cooperation with China was initiated under President George W. Bush and continued under President Barack Obama. Following a summit between President Bush and Chinese President Hu Jintao in April 2006, it was agreed that the NASA administrator, one of my predecessors, would travel to China to begin exploratory discussions on space cooperation with Chinese officials. Subsequent to that successful visit in 2007, NASA and China established working groups focused on Earth and space science cooperation. In their November 2009 joint statement, President Obama and President Hu noted that they look forward to, and I quote, to expanding discussions on space science cooperation and starting a dialogue on human spaceflight and space exploration based on the principles of transparency, reciprocity, and mutual benefit, unquote. As a result, I traveled to China in October 2010 to continue and expand our discussions on potential space cooperation. In response to limitations enacted by Public Law 112-10, NASA immediately suspended all activities under NASA's agreement with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The suspension of this agreement precludes NASA from directly receiving global navigation satellite system, satellite laser ranging, and very long baseline interferometry data from stations in China. In addition, NASA canceled all plans for reciprocal visits and bilateral activities. NASA employees and contractors continue to participate in multilateral activities through such multinational organizations as the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, in which representatives of the PRC organizations or companies may also participate. In closing, let me assure this subcommittee that any NASA engagement with China entities will be conducted in a manner that is consistent with all existing U.S. laws and regulations. I believe, however, that some level of engagement with China in space-related areas in the future can form the basis for dialogue and cooperation in a manner that is consistent with the national interest of both our countries when based on the principles of transparency, reciprocity, and mutual benefit. Initial discussions in areas such as orbital debris mitigation and disaster management could provide benefits to the United States and perhaps eventually form the basis for continued dialogue in other areas of space exploration. Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for your continued support of NASA. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions you or other members of the committee may have.
Well, thank you both for your testimony, and we appreciate you coming here today to have this discussion. We'll just get right down to some of the details here. Dr. Holdren, who was it who suggested to you that only things like this in terms of your interaction with foreign governments is only based on presidential authority, and that thus, by saying the only word means the legislative branch does not have jurisdiction? Who is it who said just?
Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't formulate it in that particular way, but I have been advised by the Department of Justice, and I've suggested that their written opinion to this effect on September 19th be added to the record, and they were very clear in their language that Section 1340A is unconstitutional as applied to certain activities undertaken pursuant to the President's constitutional authority to conduct the foreign relations of the United States. That's an exact quote. And they went on to say that OSTP's officers and employees therefore may engage in those activities as agents designated by the President for the conduct of diplomacy with the People's Republic of China. I'm not a lawyer. I asked, the White House asked that a Department of Justice lawyer be provided here to answer those legal questions. I can't debate the law with you, but that request was unfortunately not granted.
That wasn't granted by us or by the Department of Justice?
My understanding, it was not granted by the committee. That is my understanding.
All right. I probably would have granted that had I known personally about it, because I think that proposition certainly deserves a great deal of discussion. And you're saying that this was the position of the Department of Justice, but it is not necessarily your position. Is that what we're hearing today?
Mr. Chairman, I am not qualified to reach positions on matter of constitutional law. I am advised by the Department of Justice that their opinion is binding on me, as an officer of the executive branch, even if their opinion is in conflict with that of the General Accounting Office. That's what I have been advised by the
All
Department
right,
of Justice.
so let's just note that let me ask you this then. This came from the Department of Justice. This did not come from your superiors at the White House.
I don't generally talk about the content of my conversations with the President, who is my superior.
Well, conversations that don't have to be personal conversations.
In the White House.
Yes.
But the Department of Justice opinion represents the administration's view of this matter, and as I said, it is binding on me in the judgment of the Office of the Legal Counsel in that department.
So if indeed Congress was to pass a law that said that government employees could not do certain actions as long as they were involved with, as long as these government employees were under the command of the executive branch, then that would be meaningless, right?
I think that's a more general statement than the one the department put out, and I again would refer you to the statement that they put
It's
out.
a
I'm not
general
going to
statement, but it's-
speculate on a
Okay,
broader
it's a general
interpretation.
statement, but let me note it's a principle, and I think that that is, I will tell you that if any of the, and let me just acknowledge what both you and General Bolton have said, this is not a partisan issue. These discussions about cooperation with China has certainly been, Republican and Democratic administrations have both taken the position that you have in terms of that cooperation is worth the benefits. It's worth getting those benefits, but we understand the risks, but it's worth the benefits. Obviously, which I disagree with, and Congressman Wolf and others, and obviously to the point that those who disagree with that were able to get that enacted into law. The only question now is whether or not the executive branch feels compelled to obey that law. And what we are getting now is that, which is not bipartisan. If this was a Republican administration, believe me, we would, there would be, and the Democrats were in charge of Congress, this would be a holocaust. I mean, it would be an uproar beyond imagination, having an administration saying that really Congress doesn't have the right to say where appropriated funds will be spent in this, as long as it deals with foreign policy. Let's go into some of the, before we get more into that, let's go into the benefits and the risks, which is what both of your basic testimony is. Do you believe that the cooperation that we had during the Clinton administration bore any similarity to the cooperation that is now being advocated by this administration in terms of space and technology cooperation?
Mr. Chairman, I would say that every administration has advocated reasonable cooperation with China, the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and you can see where that decision has borne the fruits of the decision, though it may have been controversial at the time. And the greatest example I can give you is the benefit of the International Space Station, which orbits today and has been for 11 years. And had we followed the philosophy of those who believe that engagement is not the proper course of action, we would not have the International Space Station today.
And at the time of that cooperation, what was the level of the Russian space program as compared to the American space program, as compared to, back in those days, the American space program versus the Chinese space program?
When the cooperation began, which was with the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, and it was the Soviet Union, we had already been to the moon, as you know. We had demonstrated that we were better than everybody else in the world, much more technically capable. So I would say that we were at the same position we are today, where we are the #1 spacefaring nation in the world and intend to stay that way.
Okay. But you don't recognize that the Chinese missile and rocket capabilities at that time were very limited, and in fact, as was the task force reported after this whole crisis and scandal emerged, that we had dramatically improved our rocket missile technology.
Mr. Chairman, I think you may misunderstand what I said. I was comparing where we are today with China with where we were in 1975 with the Soviet Union.
Right.
And at that time, we were heavily engaged in the Cold War, and both nations had nuclear missiles poised
That's right.
at each other.
Well,
and so I think we were in much more dire stress then than we are today.
General, let me point this out to you, that the Russian rockets that were available then were very capable, and at the same level as our own rockets. Now, whether or not they were able to get to the moon is another issue. The Chinese rockets, when we began cooperating with them during the 1990s, the Long March rocket had a huge failure rate, until, of course, Americans cooperated with them, and their failure rate was diminished dramatically, meaning they became going to like 9 out of 10 couldn't make it up because they didn't have the right stage separation or the right fairings, or they could carry one payload. Do you think it's a good thing that now that the Chinese were able, after our cooperation, to carry more than one payload on their rockets, and that now 9 out of 10 of their rockets succeed rather than blow up on the launch pad?
Mr. Chairman, I can only speak as the NASA administrator, and my #1 job is to ensure the success of our crews as we go to and from space, as we fly through the atmosphere in aeronautics, and as we conduct the international cooperation that we do. And I can only say that from the standpoint of NASA, as far as I know, since our engagement with China, Russia, any other nation began, there are no documented cases of transfer of technology, that gave advantage to any other nation. Not from NASA arrangements, NASA agreements. We have guarded our technology and
General,
kept it from being transferred.
Let me just suggest that you have not read the task force, the Congressional Task Force on Technology Transfer to China, that was done and voted on and unanimously voted in a bipartisan fashion that totally contradict your last statement. So I'm not saying you're being you're lying or anything. I'm just saying that you haven't read that, or you wouldn't have made that statement, because there was a major investigation into the transfer of technology because of this cooperation. A bipartisan task force, it was the Cox report, was issued, and it was unanimously accepted by both parties, which concluded that there had been great damage to our security based on that cooperation. Mr. Holdren, have you read that report, that task force?
I have read a summary of it. I have not read the report.
All right.
And I think the question that is not clear from the summaries so far is whether that was NASA cooperation or the cooperation that went on between private company and China at the time.
Correct. And that is a very good distinction. And let me note that when NASA cooperates, quite usually what happens as follows: is there's cooperation by major high-tech corporations in the United States, and that's what usually is the purpose of the NASA cooperation, is to further that direct contact. I don't think that the people that I know would agree with you, either one of you, in terms of the benefits outweigh the risks. I'm not sure what the benefits to the American people are. We know that the Chinese have now been producing major consumer items in the United States with capabilities that our companies, major corporations involved in technology, have been able to ship there. I don't understand how that benefits the American people. Maybe it's good for American workers to have those jobs, earning a little bit more money rather than having the Chinese produce these products, which they have not developed and that our companies have. let me just note, as far as your last statement, I personally investigated this issue in the 1990s. I was here, and I spent a considerable amount of time in the field, going to the actual companies and seeing exactly how they were cooperating back and forth. And one of the things the Chinese did not have was stage separation at the time. After this cooperation, there was stage separation among their rockets. Out of 9 out of 10 worked. Before, 9 out of 10 didn't work. That's not good. That, I don't know, and if that in and of itself says, that is, how does that stack up to us being able to get certain things manufactured there at a cheaper price? Especially when the other thing that we gave them was the ability to have more than one payload on their rockets, meaning MIRVing in the military sense. We provided that to the Chinese. Now, providing the world's worst human rights abuser, which is now building up its military and making and being demonstrably hostile to the United States in the South China Sea and elsewhere, and making alliances with every other vicious gangster regime in the world, I do not understand what benefit we get by perfecting their rockets and giving them the ability to MIRV and to throw 3 nuclear weapons at us per rocket rather than 1. But that's what this is all about. That's what this hearing's all about. That's why that was written into the law. It was written into the law because Frank Wolf, who's a member of Congress, who also went through that same investigation, and Dana Rohrabacher and others who have been watching this issue for a long time, are aware of the specifics. And we convinced our friends in the legislative branch to put that into law. The President then signed it into law without a reservation, stating that there is a constitutional question here whether or not the legislative branch has a right to limit the expenditure of money that is used by the executive branch in determining foreign policy relationships. So this issue seems to be, please feel free to answer those points.
Yeah, I would, Mr. Chairman, like to respond on a couple of points.
Yes, sir.
First of all, I certainly don't dispute that there have been instances of technology transfer to China that we did not wish and should not have welcomed. That is part of the cost and liability that has to be traded off against the benefits. I think it is possible to exaggerate the importance of any one technology transfer by assuming the Chinese would never have figured that out on their own if they hadn't gotten it by technology transfer. Usually what happens is these technology transfers accelerate by some amount, but not always a great deal, the acquisition of a capability that's important to a country. But I don't dispute there was a loss there. But there have been many benefits, and I point out on pages 5 and 6 of my written testimony a number of them. I'll mention a few more. We have cooperated with China in the domain of public health and disease in ways that have greatly increased our capacity to respond to epidemics that originate in China, which many influenzas do, and have enhanced our capacity to deal in the biological regime with invasive species, with pests that originate in China. Our cooperation with China on nuclear safety has reduced the chances that a Chinese nuclear reactor will suffer an accident. If a Chinese nuclear reactor suffers a big accident, as reactors in Fukushima, Japan recently did, that puts in jeopardy our own capacity to operate our nuclear reactor system. It puts in jeopardy the consent of the public to operate this important component.
You've just given us some good examples of mutual benefit.
Exactly.
But can you give me an example of just benefit? Where, I mean, this is, yeah, I can understand why they'd want us to come in and help make sure that they don't have epidemics, and I can understand why they'd be happy to have us perfect their nuclear program.
Yeah, I'd be happy to give you an example of a straight benefit.
Yes.
Again, in the dialogue on innovation policy,
Yes.
which was a negotiation, the Chinese were persuaded to relinquish policies they had put in place which discriminated against American businesses. And I can tell you that the American business community that works in China is very grateful for the effort we made and for the benefit we got.
So the benefit that you're saying now is we persuaded them, the Communist Chinese government, to quit restricting our American businessmen who want to put our technology in China. That's a benefit to us?
No, our businessmen who want to sell products made in America in the Chinese market. And that is a benefit to American workers, it's a benefit to
the way
our
you stated
economy,
it
it's a
could-
benefit to our balance of payments.
Okay, so the benefit is that there were certain things that we were not permitted to sell in China, and you weren't saying that we eliminated their restrictions on actually putting things into China, meaning technology that would permit them to have greater manufacturing capabilities, things like that.
Mr. Chairman, I would not guarantee that in some of the forms of cooperation, including joint ventures between U.S. companies and Chinese companies, there will be some transfer of technology. The key issue there is one of intellectual property rights, and that transfer of technology be compensated to the satisfaction of the owners of the intellectual property. But I would assert that among the benefits of the agreements we secured from the Chinese on their innovation policy was increased access to Chinese markets for American products made in America by American workers.
Well, we have read it differently because the read that I have had of American access to their markets has been that they have continued to have major restrictions on our ability to sell finished goods, but they are perfectly willing to permit us to go to their market and sell them what is necessary to the technology necessary to build up their own manufacturing capabilities. We may be talking about the same thing.
I think we have more to do in these negotiations. That's one of the reasons I'm eager to continue them. We haven't gotten everything that we need in terms of access to Chinese markets and non-discrimination against American firms, but we're making progress. We need to make more. It will be to the benefit of American firms, American workers, and the American economy when we do.
All right, and we'll have a second round, but I've been taking up too much time already. Mr. Carnahan, would you like to, or Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses for being here today. You've given us, I think, a fuller picture of this bigger debate. Certainly the give and take tug of war between Congress and the Administration on Foreign Affairs is not new. That's been going on probably since the very beginning of this country. And I appreciate Mr. Holdren, you very succinctly and simply described the relationship with China as complex. That's probably an understatement. But I too am of the belief that it's important that we look for ways to maximize the benefits of engagement while at the same time minimizing those risks, and that certainly engagement outweighs any of those risks. And I appreciate also the fact that in the context of the executive branch that you sought the appropriate legal advice in pursuing this meeting. Folks in Congress may disagree with this, and I think that this is a legitimate issue for us to be talking about here today. But I wanted to really get into an area that really gets to the heart of this matter in terms of what protections are in place to ensure that as we engage in this dialogue at all levels, that we are maximizing those benefits and minimizing those risks. And let me start with Mr. Holdren.
Sure, there are a wide variety of protections in place that apply to these interactions and other interactions. We have a variety of restrictions on the kinds of technologies that can be transferred to China, and appropriately so, in our export restrictions. We have a variety of programs in place, including under the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, that tracks acquisitions by Chinese and other foreign entities of businesses in the United States that could have adverse impacts on our national security through technology transfer or by other means. OSTP, by the way, is a voting member of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and reviews all of these matters. In the domains of cybersecurity, which have been alluded to by some of the previous witnesses, we have a very wide and robust interagency set of measures that address the cybersecurity threats associated with China and other countries. When we travel to China, we take extensive precautions in interaction with the appropriate U.S. intelligence agencies to ensure that no sensitive or classified information is compromised. We are very well aware in this administration, as previous administrations have been, of the liabilities and the risks associated with these kinds of interactions, and we are taking every step that we can think of to minimize those risks and liabilities. Some of those measures, of course, fall in the classified domain. We would not be able to discuss them here, but I would be happy in a suitable venue to provide more detail.
Thank you. And General Bolden, the U.S., China, and Russia are the only three countries with manned spaceflight capability. We recently ceased operating our shuttle fleet. What risks are posed to the U.S. Space program if we're not cooperating with China and Russia and with the broader international coalition that we work with in terms of our space program?
Mr. Carnahan, what risk we take is that we lose our position of leadership in the world, and it is tenuous even as we speak today, because we are the only one of the international partners involved with the International Space Station that does not have a working relationship with China. But again, I would say, in my case, you know, I'm responsible for the space agency and not science and technology advice to the President, as is Dr. Holdren. So my area of expertise and my area of responsibility is very limited. When we did have bilateral dealings with China, they were in the areas of geodynamics research, which was, you're essentially talking about how can we predict earthquakes, and then what do we do after it occurs, areas like orbital degree mitigation. And so there is not my concern that NASA you know, will be subjected to providing technical information as the chairman is concerned, and we limit it that way. We have an agency-wide export control board that determines what we can do in terms of export control, and we are part of the interagency process, as Dr. Holdren described. So NASA is very limited in what we do in terms of the concerns that are expressed by the committee.
And finally, I want to get your comment. You described limitations in suspending or canceling certain bilateral activities with China pursuant to the law, but of course, you are authorized to continue multilateral engagement and activities with China. Does this make any real practical difference? That engagement has to be done in a multilateral setting that you cannot do in a bilateral setting?
Let me make sure I understand your question. Are you saying that by not being able to do it in a bilateral setting, does it limit my ability to carry out what NASA is supposed to do?
Right, to really continue the mission of NASA.
Yeah. To date, or right now, it does not limit my ability to do the three primary things that the Congress of the United States and the President have designated for us, the three priorities that we have right now, which is the formulation of an exploration program consisting of a heavy lift launch vehicle, a crew module, expansion of utilization of the International Space Station by bringing about the vibrant commercial industry that can provide us transportation to and from space. so that I can stop having to pay our Russian partners to do that as I do right now. And then thirdly, focusing in the area of science on the James Webb Space Telescope as the dominant science project, but also in the area of earth science, and where we did cooperate with the Chinese, but we have other entities that provide us that information. So it's not critical right now. Cessation of multilateral participation would put us on the outside looking in. We would not be able to participate in things like UN Copious. I can go on and on with international conferences, congresses, the UN. Again, NASA would just be on the outside looking in, and we would serve no purpose for the nation.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap up my time because I know we've got a colleague that wants to engage in this as well. I'm going to yield at this point.
Thank you, Mr.
Wait a minute now.
Yes.
I want to know specifically how to pronounce your name.
Cicilline.
Cicilline.
You've been practicing that.
Congressman Cicilline, you take as much time as you'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General Bolden and Director Holdren, for being here. As I reviewed both the testimony that you just provided as well as the written testimony that was provided and reviewed by me last evening, certainly the subject of the dangers of engagement with China was the subject of a lot of this material. But what struck me in reviewing this carefully was that there's another danger, which I'd really like to ask Dr. Holdren about. And it really stems from an intention by the Chinese to really invest in innovation in a very, very serious way. In February of 2006, China's State Council issued the National Medium and Long-Term Program for Science and Technology Development, which we often refer to as MLP. And in that, they committed to changing China within 15 years from a major manufacturing center to a major global source of innovation. And by 2050, to make China a global leader in innovation. And the plan further says that by 2020, gross expenditures for research and development would rise to 2.5% of GDP from 1.3% in 2005, so nearly doubling it. And when you look at sort of that kind of a serious investment in innovation and research and development in a time when we are being, when some of my colleagues in the Congress of the United States are in fact making strong arguments for reducing investments in research and development and innovation. And it struck me as I reviewed this that poses a great danger to our innovation economy and to the long-term economic prosperity of our country. And I'd like to know sort of your thoughts generally about what sort of policies we should be pursuing so that we remain competitive, particularly when faced with that sort of investment by the Chinese. And then I have a second part to the question, but I'd like you to go to that part first.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that question. Certainly, the Chinese intend to be our competitor in high technology. They are already our economic competitor in a variety of regimes. I noted that in my testimony, and they intend to do better. We still have the best colleges and universities in the world. We still have the best research laboratories in the world. We still out-innovate everybody in the world. In order to maintain that lead, we are going to need to continue to make the investments in research and development, the investments in our research universities and our national laboratories, and the investments in our education system, particularly science, technology, engineering, and math education, that the President is calling for, and which, again, have historically been a matter of bipartisan agreement. The need to make these investments in the basis of our future, in science, technology, innovation, and their application to the economy, to our security, to the environment. This is something at which we have been the best. We need to continue to be the best. But the notion that China intends to compete with us does not mean that the solution is to disengage from them. Germany competes with us, England competes with us, Russia competes with us. Increasingly, countries in South America want to compete with us. We do not generally conclude that the solution to competition is disengagement. The solution is intelligent engagement, measured, focused, appropriately managed, so that we get the benefits for our own innovation system, that we help other countries get particular benefits that are in our interest, and that we stay engaged with the best minds at the best facilities in the world wherever they may be. The President has said very clearly that to win the future, we need to out-educate, out-build, and out-innovate everybody else. We plan to continue to do that, but part of doing that is also staying engaged with everybody else.
Thank you, Dr. Children. And the second issue, and I apologize if you addressed this, I had to step out for a minute. If you did, I apologize. I wonder if you would just comment on how effective the strategic and economic dialogue has been, or any other dialogues that have been been engaged with between the United States and China over the theft of intellectual property and forced technology transfer policies. Particularly, I'm interested to know whether China has followed through on its commitments to delink indigenous innovation policies from public procurement at all levels of government. I represent a state that has a long history of manufacturing, and have heard from a number of manufacturers in my home state about experiences they've had with the theft of intellectual property and the challenges they face. And I think we all agree that in the in level playing field, we have the greatest innovators, the greatest manufacturers, the greatest workers in the world, but the theft of intellectual property and this opportunity for public procurement only to come about as a result of the transfer of intellectual property remains an issue. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on where we stand in that, and whether the dialogue has been helpful in protecting American workers and American manufacturers in that regard.
First of all, it does remain an issue. We have made progress, but as I said a moment ago, we need to make much more. One of the interesting things to which the Chinese have agreed as a result of our interaction in the dialogue on innovation policy and the strategic and economic dialogue is to have a bilateral team of technology experts set up that actually goes out into the field, into the provinces, into the cities, to find out whether the new instructions from the central government about eliminating some of these discriminatory policies and being unattentive to the theft of intellectual property, to see whether that's really happening. And this is extraordinary. I mean, this is the equivalent of accepting on-site verification in arms control, which was always a great challenge to achieve. The Chinese have accepted this. The president of China in the summit in January announced that China was abandoning these particular policies, and they are committed to make stronger efforts to protect intellectual property. I might just add that probably no American company has suffered a greater loss of intellectual property to China than Microsoft. And we have the Chief Strategy Officer of Microsoft as a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, Craig Mundy, and he is participating energetically and enthusiastically with me as part of the U.S. delegation to the dialogue on innovation policy as a member of PCAST, because he believes that we are making progress, and of course that we need to make more, and therefore we need to continue it.
Well, I want to thank the witnesses. I know I took a long time, and the chairman's prerogative. It took a long time for me to get to be a chairman, so I could actually take that time. But I was hoping that Mr. Carnahan would have another chance if he had anything else to ask. Just a couple of thoughts, and that is, I think, number one, that we're talking about an issue of legality, that constitutionality, which these witnesses have made sure that, and we understand that you are not the definers of what's constitutional and what's not, and you are part of an administration and will take direction from your president, which is appropriate. And I think there is a major constitutional issue here. After hearing the testimony, I believe there is a major constitutional issue to be determined about whether or not Congress does have the rights to limit you and your jobs and what your personnel can do in the area of that steps in the foreign policy arena. Are we permitted then to as Congress to say that you cannot expend those funds, thus you cannot have your people doing these things? And the Department of Justice obviously has said that no, foreign policy belongs to the executive branch, and that will have to be determined. And I appreciate you coming here realizing that that's the core of the dispute, I also appreciate both of you coming here in order to argue your case for the benefit of the policy itself and not the constitutionality necessarily of it. And I think on that we have some major disagreements. And I would think that the great investment, the only thing I know personally is, well, I worked with the Reagan administration for 7 years. And again, I noted earlier that when Reagan increased the level of cooperation with the Chinese, it was predicated in those very agreements and statements that he made that this is based on a liberalization continuing in China that had led to a very robust democracy movement, which after Tiananmen Square was slaughtered. And China actually has less democratic rights now than they had then, although they've had a lot of economic progress. I'm not convinced that making dictatorship more efficient and providing more wealth will lead to democratization. But I understand there are people who honestly believe that if we increase the level of wealth of a country, you will eventually eliminate the ghouls and the goons and the gangsters who run some of these countries. I did not see that in Russia. Ronald Reagan, to the degree that there was some cooperation going on, would never have agreed to most favored nation status, and in fact ratcheted up the other type of confrontations that we had with Russia, which actually bankrupted their system. It was not benevolent acts that won them over that led to the destruction of the Communist Party dictatorship in Russia. It was just the opposite. And so with that said, at least that's in the chairman's opinion. And I want to thank you again for coming today. And there will be, if there's any written questions that we have, we'll submit them to you and hope they could get back to us in a timely manner. And so this part of the hearing is over. And again, thank you to the witnesses. And I will be right back. And for our final panel, we have Rick Fisher, who is a senior fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center and an expert on Chinese military development. He has previously served as a senior fellow for the Center for Security Policy and editor of the Jamestown Foundation's China Brief, and as a senior fellow with the White House Republican Policy Committee. Adam Siegel is the Ira Lipman Senior Fellow at the Counterterrorism and National Security Studies for the Council on Foreign Relations. Before going to the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Siegel was an arms control analyst for the China Project at the Union of Concerned Scientists and has recently written a book entitled Advantage: How American Innovation Can Overcome the Asian Challenge. We appreciate both of you being here, and you may proceed with your testimony, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is an honor to appear before this committee to assist your deliberations on this very important issue. Mr. Chairman, I very much appreciate your leadership in working tirelessly to alert the country to the dangers emerging from the People's Republic of China and the need to protect ourselves, defend ourselves. I'm also very grateful for the leadership of Congressman Wolf and grateful for his testimony today. I'm also grateful for your mentioning of the Cox report. As you mentioned, I had the opportunity briefly to work for Chris Cox just after his report was released. And at that time, I remember the crisis in our relationship with the PRC. We were discovering that the espionage, the military potential was very great. One of my favorite stories that emerged from that period was about the former Martin Marietta Corporation and how a Chinese engineer explained to me one evening how solid fuel rocket technology from a kick motor that Martin Marietta had sold to or had used on a U.S. satellite revealed to the Chinese how to perfect their own solid fuel rocket motors. Well, that rocket motor became the basis for the DF-21 medium-range ballistic missile. The DF-21 became the basis for the anti-satellite system used successfully in 2007 and is also the basis for the new anti-ship ballistic missile, the DF-21D, that is a revolutionary weapon targeting our aircraft carriers and other large ships in Asia. So what I stressed in my written testimony was the real dangers that can emerge from uncontrolled and unmonitored cooperation with China in space. I've been studying the People's Liberation Army, writing about its modernization for about 15 years. A large part of that time I've spent focused on monitoring China's space program. And there are two fundamental observations that one must make. The first is that the Chinese space program is controlled by the People's Liberation Army. They are the ones that set the priorities. They control the programs. The second, obvious conclusion that I have drawn is that China's space program is nearly entirely dual use. Everything that the Chinese put into space, including their manned space program, is designed to produce military benefit for the People's Liberation Army in the conduct of military operations on Earth. All of the first 7 Shenzhou missions, their first manned space capsule, conducted some form of military mission, and I've listed those in my testimony. Shenzhou 7 in 2008, September 2008, did something completely different, though. It flew to a point about 27 miles from the International Space Station. Just before it reached that point, though, it launched a microsatellite. So you essentially had this body moving 17,000 miles an hour with a projectile out in front of it, and there was 2 Russians and an American on the International Space Station. I've written that this raised the possibility of real danger to those on board the ISS. But, Mr. Chairman, I cannot find a single statement by a U.S. government official questioning this incident or reacting to it. And so this will continue. The space lab that was launched on September 29 has surveillance capabilities. The future space station that will be launched in about the 2020 timeframe will be easily configured for military missions. Space plane, the same thing. In my opinion, this dual-use character will continue with the PLA's space program to the moon and beyond. So to help illuminate these dangers, I've suggested in my testimony 3 questions that the administration should answer to try to satisfy the many concerns that have been expressed today and for many years by the Congress. The first question is, does the vast difference in PRC and U.S. space transparency mean that any level of contact between official, corporate, or university sectors could pose a disproportionate threat to the United States. All individuals that we could possibly invite to the United States from China to cooperate in space programs, how do we know who they really work for? A second question, does the clear dual-use nature of the PLA Chinese space program mean that potential U.S.-Chinese space cooperation will never produce the same mutual benefit for the United States? Whatever China learns from our space program will be applied to assist military goals. Our space program is civilian. It is not producing military benefit, at least directly, for the U.S. military. Third, does the PRC's aggressive pursuit of pervasive espionage also dictate that the benefits of U.S. PRC space cooperation will never be mutual? And finally, I ask, does the proposition that U.S. PRC cooperation in space can improve their relations on Earth really stand up to historical examination? We've heard in the testimony today reference to the 1975 U.S., Russian, Soviet Soyuz mission. Well, that was all fine and good, but after 1975, China, Russia, the Soviet Union proceeded to build greater and more dangerous weapons to put into space, and they would have done so had the Soviet Union survived past 1990. I think the proposition is simply not backed up by the history, and those who feel that we can advance terrestrial relations with China by cooperating with space have really got it backwards. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Dr. Siegel.
I want to thank the chair and the other distinguished members of the committee for the invitation to speak here today. It is a real honor. While I share many of the committee's concerns about China's rise as a science and technology power, I respectfully differ on the means for addressing that challenge. One of China's great strengths has been a laser-like focus on shaping foreign interactions to serve its national innovation goals. By comparison, the United States is greatly handicapped as it lacks the ability to gather a comprehensive picture of science and technology exchanges with China and to coordinate its response to some of the most malevolent aspects of China's rise. The solution is not to cut off all exchanges with China. What is needed is a more comprehensive approach, and so instead of limiting funding for the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the more strategic response would be to actually expand support for the OSTP. To be sure, there are challenges in how China is pursuing its objectives in science and technology and how it might use the results for economic and military power. It is clear that China's goals are ambitious. As the 2006 medium to long-term plan states, China's goal is to become an innovation nation by 2020 and a global scientific power by 2050. Investment in R&D has grown by 20% a year since 1999 and is expected to top $153 billion by this year. China, as is well known to this committee, has adopted mercantilist policies to foster indigenous innovation. Procurement strategies, competing technology standards, and the failure to protect IPR have all been adopted in order to create new barriers and force technology transfer. U.S. intellectual property is now widely targeted by cyber hackers and industrial spies. Since 2010, Google, NASDAQ, DuPont, Johnson & Johnson, General Electric, RSA, and at least a dozen others have proprietary information stolen. And on Monday, Symantec released a new report tracing attacks on 48 chemical and defense industries back to China. China has also leveraged the globalization of science and technology to improve the technological capabilities of its defense sectors. Shifting research centers to China and developing collaborative business relations with Chinese companies inadvertently involves American institutions in the diffusion process, speeding Beijing's military modernization. The shipping and telecommunications industries, for example, have made steady improvements in R&D through their engagement with the international economy, and this has resulted in quieter subs and more advanced C4ISR capabilities. But the rise of new science powers, China, but also India and Brazil, presents an extremely valuable opportunity for the United States. For the last 50 years, we have assumed that the scientific dominance of the United States will continue. This assumption is now in question, as scientific capabilities will be more widely distributed in the future. From 2002 to 2007, for example, developing countries, including China, India, and Brazil, more than doubled their expenditures on R&D, increasing their contributions to world R&D spending from 17% to 24%. The United States has been one of the major beneficiaries of globalization in science and technology, and American society is probably better positioned than any other to tap into these new sources of discovery. The dominance of the American computer industry was built on the ability to develop global design and manufacturing networks. Immigrant scientists and entrepreneurs have been a major source of dynamism in our universities and our startup culture. The globalization of science and technology has also played a role in American military dominance. American universities and private companies, not federal labs, provide much of the technology required for the U.S. military to keep its qualitative lead over potential challengers. These same universities and private companies need access to talent in markets in developing economies, especially China, to remain competitive. Abandoning S&T exchanges is not a strategy. The United States needs a strategy that's not just whole of government that entails the numerous views of department agencies, but a whole of society strategy that includes the companies, entrepreneurs, scientists, and universities that drive the globalization of science and technology. While parts of that strategy are clear, and I would include reinvigorating the U.S. innovation system and pressing China broadly on indigenous innovation and other predatory policies, much of it remains uncertain because China is opaque and the bilateral relationships are so complicated. The OSTP should be well positioned to help develop that strategy, to provide insights into Chinese motivations and plans, and to a larger context of how global science and technology is evolving. For most of the last 30 years, the bilateral science and technology relationship was basically an afterthought in the U.S.-China relations, though it was often a source of stability in a relationship that has seen its ups and downs over Taiwan, trade, and human rights. Today, science and technology plays an increasingly central role in economic and national security interests in relations with China. These interests are better served by a more capable OSDP, one that has access to more information and is better able to coordinate a U.S. response than one that is severely limited. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
Well, thank you both, and just a couple of questions here. Mr. Fisher, you, when people talk about cooperating with or actual investment by American companies, that was described by Mr. Holder there, that technology and that investment that we have, you know, when we're going over there selling those products, you're suggesting that there's almost always a dual use to those products.
Well, in many cases, yes, Mr. Chairman. When General Electric proposes to help develop a new turbofan engine with China, that definitely has a dual use. The engine that will emerge from that cooperation will inform significantly a indigenous Chinese engine that will power transport aircraft, that will power bombers, that will be taking troops around the world.
Okay, so let me be real clear here about what we're talking about, because when we were discussing the benefit that this China trade had to the United States, we were saying that we'd had some great progress and that we've convinced the Chinese to permit us to sell some of our technology products over there. General Electric might be one of those examples that they now are they're permitting us to sell our technology over there, which will then permit them to have an aerospace industry that will put our people out of work. Is that the sort of the?
It's a painful caricature, Mr. Chairman. For decades, we've been complaining about the trade imbalance with China. The Chinese invariably always respond, well, you could sell us some more of your technology. We'll buy that. And of course, they want that technology because of the dual-use implication.
Right. So we end up creating their manufacturing base by selling them things, that technology that they, what a great victory it is. They've agreed to buy our technology that will make them better at producing things that eventually can be sold here, but also can be used to upgrade their military capabilities, like jet engines and things such as that. And the the PLA owns many of these companies that are partnering with these American companies. Isn't that right?
Well, the companies are controlled by the government. The PLA exercises control. I wouldn't so much call it ownership, but control. The PLA controls the money that funds them, funds their programs. The PLA sets the priorities. that then are carried out in terms of research, development, and production.
Okay. Dr. Siegel, you mentioned in your testimony that tens of thousands of Chinese students have come to the United States and to learn, and you see that, and have returned home. And you see this as a good thing? That we have now taken Chinese students at PhD level, which we have spent millions, if not billions of dollars developing the technology and the science that we now are imparting to them, and then they go home and use it to develop their country to be more competitive?
And actually, my preference would be that they would stay here, quite honestly, that we encourage Chinese PhDs, engineers, other graduates with science and engineering degrees to stay here, to start companies, and be involved in the U.S. innovative capabilities. And that I think, is what we should be trying to do. We should try to promote them. And that's what traditionally has happened, in fact. We've only started seeing an early phase of some scientists going back.
Of course, your preference that they stay here, but how many do? And you wouldn't say something to that, Mr. Fisher?
When you're finished.
Okay, I was just going to suggest that, number one, we have a limited number of PhD programs. We have a limited number of students that we're going to permit into our major universities at this high level. We're not talking about tens of thousands a year. I think we're probably talking a couple thousand a year. For us to try to suggest that we should fill those ranks with as many Chinese students as we can, as compared to filling the ranks with, let's say, American students that were A- students rather than A+ students, I think it might be more beneficial to our country to have those Americans. By the way, those Americans might be Chinese Americans too, and they might be, you know, Afro-Americans or Irish Americans, whatever, but they're Americans as compared to Chinese nationalists.
I think the problem has been, as you said, over the last 2 decades, that American universities at the PhD level have been very dependent on overseas students to fill PhD and master's programs. That has been because American-born students, no matter what their ethnic or other heritage, have chosen not to go into the sciences, mainly for economic incentive reasons, right? If you are a smart young American, you're going to look at what the financial sector was making versus over what it was going to be a PhD for 10 years.
So the Chinese actually said, we're going to pay all of your expenses if you go over there to that university and get that PhD and come back. And the Americans have been told, if you get this PhD, you're going to be able to graduate and have a $200,000 debt to pay back for the rest of your life.
Well, that's why I think the answer to that solution is to make science and engineering degrees more attractive to American university students. In fact, the widespread assumption is that Americans aren't interested in science and math. But if you do most surveys of freshman classes, about a third of them, in fact, say, yes, I'm interested in science and math.
Well, I think that that's true, that we should be encouraging our students to, our schools to be taking American students, and we should be making it easier for them. But that still doesn't really get to the point where we are now bolstering China's capabilities, and bolstering China's capabilities, this is the debate. I mean, some people, and I think the title of your book does suggest that innovation in itself is a good thing, but maybe you're just suggesting the innovation on the American side would be what will make this a better world, not necessarily a general innovation encompasses the dictatorships of the world as well.
The book is focused on how to improve American innovation capabilities, but historically, the students that you're talking about have stayed, right? We look at Chinese and Indians in Silicon Valley and Route 128 and all those other places. They have stayed. We are now starting to see people going back, but again, most of those people are maintaining connections to the United States, right? They are, in the language of Annalise Exinian from Berkeley, Argonauts, right? Traveling in space all of the time, back and forth between the US and China. That, I think, is a better outcome, right, than them just going back to China.
I would think that anything is a better outcome when, after a 10-year period, you can show that the standard of living of the American people has been increased and improved because of that, and the safety of our people has been improved and the prosperity of our country has been improved as compared to what I see, which is our relationship with China has led to an improvement in their situation, but not ours. It seems to be that there's wealth being transferred here via the knowledge that goes into producing wealth, that we have taken the intellectual property that we've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in, and it now is working for the benefit of other people. And worst of all, the other people happen to be run by a government that is the most vicious anti-human rights government in the world.
But again, I think
you
if
had
you look at
something, Mr. Fisher?
if you just look at the numbers again on immigrant entrepreneurship, right? Those people are starting companies in the United States. They're hiring locally. They're developing locally, and they're innovating locally. So that's, I think, a situation.
I'm not against legal immigration in the United States and making it targeted towards people who want to invest from there, but when they send people over here so that they can be educated, and then they go home with billions of dollars worth of information in their head that the American people have paid for, that's not in our benefit. Mr. Fisher, and then we'll go on to our
Mr.
colleague.
Chairman, I just wanted to comment that for many years I've been hearing from colleagues that the counterintelligence challenge of monitoring Chinese students, graduate students that come to the United States to learn very specific technical skills which they take back to China is one of the most, one of the greatest unaddressed counterintelligence challenges that we face. In my testimony on page 11, I describe an example of how a Chinese student actually gained a visiting fellowship in a laboratory connected to the former Lewis, but now John Glenn Research Center of NASA in Cleveland, Ohio, and got a head start in creating China's competency in ceramic matrix composite materials, which are used for reentry and for other things like missile warheads, nose cones. Professor Zhang Letong was able to come to Cleveland in I believe it was April of 1989. Despite the Tiananmen embargo, she was able to remain at these NASA laboratories until 1991. And her biographies, her Chinese biographies, are all glowing about how she took her foreign research back home to China to create China's competency in ceramic matrix composites. Just this last January, she was featured on a Chinese television show that was about how her laboratory was contributing to China's first small experimental space plane.
I think that speaks for itself. Thank you, and
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cicilline.
Cicilline, I'm going to get that right. Cicilline, yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Fisher and Dr. Siegel, for your thoughtful and informative testimony. I want to just pick up first on this issue of innovation and entrepreneurship and the great universities in America, because I think one of the things, it was interesting during our orientation for new members of Congress at the Kennedy School at Harvard University, the president of Harvard University spoke to us and actually challenged us to focus on what she saw as one of the biggest challenges facing our country, and that was the loss of this great intellectual capacity that is graduating out of the world's best universities here in America. And the challenge is that it's not that they come here to study at the great universities, the greatest universities in the world, like Brown University in my district, and then they choose to leave, but we actually kick them out. They're not free to stay. And so I think one of the challenges we have to look at is how do we encourage people from all over the world to continue to see America as a great beacon of intellectual development and innovation, so that they not only come to study at our great universities, but they remain here to start companies, hire Americans, locally innovate, and build companies, and rather than lose that capacity to go back and do the same thing in another country. And so I think we lose that. The second part of it that I think we lose is the opportunity to show people all over the world the power of democracy, to be a student here and study and see how America functions as the world's best and strongest and most productive democracy has huge value. It changes students forever, and they become very often ambassadors of democracy back in their own homes. So I just want to say that I think you, Dr. Siegel, have made that point, and I think it's an important one. What I'd like you to address, as I reviewed your testimony today and your written testimony, what really struck me was that I'd just like to point out a couple of things that you mentioned, and that is, first, the importance of the United States maintaining its scientific strength here at home, that the United States remains the world leader in science and technology, but that there are some developing nations like China and India and Brazil who have more than doubled their expenditures on research and development from 2002 to 2007. And China in particular has grown its investment by 20% a year since 1999 and expected to exceed $153 billion of investment this year alone. And what I think is really alarming is China is producing an enormous number of scientists and engineers from their graduate schools, in excess of 2 million in 2009 alone. And so I think when we look at what do we do, what are the policies we should put into place as a country, they obviously include investments in science and research, and particularly focusing on STEM education to ensure that we have the workforce and the ability to compete successfully. But one of the challenges we face is even if we make all the right investments in science and research, in innovation, in higher education, we end up with an uneven playing field because of the theft of intellectual property and because of Chinese practices of requiring the transfer of intellectual property. So while I'm going to keep advocating for what we need to do to compete successfully and win, if at the end of the process, the Chinese or others simply get to steal what we've, the results of that investment, from K through 12 to to Head Start to Pell Grants and all of the infrastructure that's necessary, I'm going to continue to advocate for that. But if at the end of it, we haven't protected our investment by successfully protecting American intellectual property, then it's hard to kind of keep advocating for it. And so what I'd like to know is what you think we should be doing. Why aren't we doing more enforcement at the WTO? What tools could we make better use of to protect this huge investment we're making in order to be sure at the end of this process we're competing successfully and winning?
Thank you very much for your question. I totally agree. There's no way that we can continue innovating and have the Chinese completely tip the table towards them, right? The free trade system is based on comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage is in innovation, and if they are going to undermine that, then you can't have that system continue to work. So besides doing things at home, I think we have to continue pressuring China on indigenous innovation and intellectual property rights. The fact that it was now at the top of the list for the strategic and economic dialogue, I think, was an important step. It was only the first step, right? We have to see, as your earlier question to Dr. Holdren suggested, we have to see how they're going to follow through. But we know what works, right? There have been specific instances with either IPR or with indigenous innovation where the Chinese have backed away. That has primarily happened when both U.S. companies and foreign countries all push in the same position. Right? What's typically happened in other cases is that you get a lot of defection. Right? U.S. companies don't want to be seen as the one who have publicly embarrassed China because they know that the Chinese government is going to punish them sometime in the future with safety inspections or other types of kind of interference with their business. And the Chinese are often very good at splitting countries, right? The EU may have this position, and the Japanese may be somewhere else. So in those instances where everyone is in a row, the Chinese have backed down. We saw this with the WAPI standard for Wi-Fi, right? Everybody stayed together and didn't back down. So I think in those kind of instances where you can get that type of thing, and that's what we should be working for, then we can push the Chinese. The other thing to do, of course, is that R&D is mobile, right? And so what you see is that if a U.S. company takes the benefits from a grant from the NSF or something at a U.S. university and then scales it up in China, that doesn't serve our purpose, right? So we have to think about how do we tie that scaling up side to local, right? How do we improve manufacturing jobs? How do we get those people? And I think part of the way to do that is to make those grants collaborative, right? To insist that companies work with other U.S. companies, that they work with U.S. universities and tie them locally. Those are two ideas.
And it would seem to me another approach would be to repeal existing tax incentives and tax breaks we give to American companies who do that kind of scaling up in China rather than here in the U.S.
Yes, no, that would also be one.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I want to thank the witnesses. First of all, Mr. Fisher, did you have a final comment that you'd like to make? And Mr. Siegel, do you have a final comment? Let me then close this hearing by saying and emphasizing something that was said by Mr. Wolf, Congressman Wolf, when he was here at the beginning of the hearing, and that is, don't mistake any of the criticism that we've made of China with a criticism of the Chinese people. China is a dictatorship in which the people do not choose their own leaders. The political leadership in China suppresses the people. The relationship is different than here. Our government reflects the will of the people, at least it should. And that's just not the case. So who are our greatest allies in correcting a bad situation that is developing between China and the United States? Our greatest ally are those people in China who want to live in freedom and in peace and want prosperity for their families as we do. And so nothing in this hearing should be interpreted as being anti-Chinese. This is anti the Beijing dictatorship. This is all these things that we're talking about are based on the fact that you have a militaristic, human rights abusing government in Beijing that is repressing their own people as much as they are threatening the stability of the rest of the world. We have seen with that regime a major transfer of wealth, perhaps the most historic voluntary transfer of wealth from one country to another in the history of the world. We have seen money and wealth that would be in the United States transferred to uplift the people of China. Now, I happen to have been there at the beginning when Reagan made this. And again, let me assert, when people are talking about Ronald Reagan, he was very clear. The reason why he was agreeing and the American establishment agreed to permit this type of policy establishing itself, because everything was established during that time period, was that there was a liberalization going on in China that would have resulted in a more democratic country that was at peace with its own people and at peace with the world. At that moment, that's what was evolving into place. Had Ronald Reagan been the president at Tiananmen Square, I have no doubt that he would have sent a telegram to the leadership of the Communist Party and said, if you unleash the army on the democratic movement in Tiananmen Square, the deal is off. No more technology transfer, no more investment, no more the United States turning around and letting this theft of our technology and investment go there. It's all over. All of our credits, that's done. The economic deal's over. That's what he would have said in this telegram. I would have written it for him. And guess what? He wasn't president. Herbert Walker Bush was president. And do you know what the telegram that Herbert Walker Bush said that he sent to the Communist Party leadership? That's it. Nothing. And when they slaughtered those people and they turned China back on a course to dictatorship and they kept China on a course of belligerency towards the Western world and towards massive repression of their own people, they didn't pay any economic price whatsoever. They benefited from it. From the Herbert, and our witnesses were correct. This is not a partisan issue. It was bipartisan governments here in the United States, both Republican and Democrat, have permitted this transfer of wealth and power to go on to this vicious dictatorship, which certainly rivals the monstrous behavior of the Hitler regime, who, of course, we shouldn't forget that IBM and a lot of American companies did business with Hitler too, didn't they? Did that make that any more peaceful in the world? No. And Germany, let us remember, was a very advanced economic country. So it's not that out of poverty you have this dictatorship. No, what you've got is you have evil forces in this world. And then you have a lot of wonderful people who populate this planet, who are wonderful people, should work together and side with each other when they see someone being oppressed. And we have a government in China that takes people in the Falun Gong, and their crime is that they believe in meditation and yoga, and that is in a religious way that's appealing to the Chinese, and the Communist Party is arresting them by the thousands, murdering them and selling their organs. I don't even think that we can get past the corporate people who are backing China here. I don't think we could get a law passed that would even say that you can't buy organs from China as long as they keep taking them from prisoners who they've executed, because a lot of their prisoners are political prisoners and religious prisoners. When we lose sight of the moral underpinnings of our policy, our country will go down and is going down in relationship to its influence and power to a vicious dictatorship by a dictatorship that does those sort of heinous deeds to their own people. So, and bolsters the strength of gangster regimes around the world. I hope that this has been interesting to those people who are reading the record and who are watching on C-SPAN. And I want to thank my fellow colleagues here, especially on the Democratic side of the aisle, because they showed up. And I hope that I know I've spoken longer than others, but I wanted my colleagues to know that they have just as much time as I would ever use, and I usually try to be fair about that.
Thank the chairman for his accommodation.
Okay. So with that said, thank you to the witnesses, and this hearing is adjourned.